So it gives me huge pleasure to invite Paul Chambers from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, where he's a Deputy Director, to talk about decarbonising the public sector in England. Paul, all yours. Round of applause.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much. And I hope you've had a good morning. I wasn't here, so I'm hoping I'm not going to repeat anything you've heard earlier. So I'm Paul Chambers. I head up the public sector team in what's now the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. We were BEIS a few months ago and made what's called a machinery of government change a few months back. And I'm going to talk this afternoon about our programme to decarbonise the public sector and some of the kind of issues and challenges we face as we sort of think about what we do in future phases of the scheme. So a bit of context, if you're sort of public sector, if you're engaged with the public sector, none of this will be a surprise. But the public sector is an incredibly sort of large and varied estate to try to work with on decarbonisation. Within central government and arm's length bodies, there's something like 100,000 buildings. Across the broader public estate, there's over 300,000 buildings. And this goes all the way from a kind of tiny rural grant-maintained primary school up to huge multi-academy trusts, big health trusts, enormous MOD sites, and lots of old and heritage buildings with quite complicated kind of planning restrictions around those. And significantly, when we're talking about this agenda, most of the public sector is subject to quite strict public spending controls. They can't take loans. They can't even do complex leases on things like PV and lighting. So very dependent on public funding. I mean, higher education, local authorities are exceptions to that. And just also to say, in terms of the scope of my work and my team's work, is that energy efficiency, most of the sort of climate policy is devolved. So Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have their own programmes, and so our remit covers England only, with a few exceptions. So things like MOD bases around the UK fall under our scope. Is that going to work? Next, where do I put? Okay, here we go. So our mission, so these go back to the Heat and Building Strategy and the Net Zero strategies, both published a couple of years ago. So our objective is to try to reduce direct emissions from public buildings by 50% by 2032, so that's the end of Carbon Budget 5, and by 75% by 2037, that's the end of Carbon Budget 6. And the focus on direct emissions is because in the context of a decarbonising grid, we let the electricity system do the heavy lifting on the electricity side, and our sort of USP is trying to get fossil fuel emissions out of public sector buildings. And if I had my laser pointer, which I don't, I would be pointing you at that chart on the right, which you may be familiar with. So you can see in pink, buildings account for about 30% of our national emissions. At the next level out, heat accounts for about 3/4 of that. So you've got a third, 3/4 of a third, and then there with a little oval circle around it is the public sector. Accounts for about 2% of national CO2 emissions, which doesn't sound very much, but I think there's a really important kind of leadership and leading by example role for the public sector that belies that percentage. So I think it's a really important mission to hit those targets for the public sector on our way towards net zero. Next one, please. So here is a quick sort of canter through the key programs that we lead, and they address 3 different barriers to decarbonising our buildings. And the first one is access to finance. As I mentioned, this is an agenda that's very dependent on capital spend on our buildings. So we run something called the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, has an annual grant round delivered by Salix Finance. And if you were here this morning, you'll have heard Annie Shepherd, the outgoing CEO of Salix, who and they deliver that for us. We've had 2.5 billion of funding over a 5-year period going right back to 2020 when it was set up. And we're currently delivering phase 3A and B are live right now, and we've just had the allocation round for phase 3C, which Salix are working through as we speak. And I'll say a little bit more about the PSDS in a moment. But we recognise that many public sector bodies don't have the skills and the capability to plan and then deliver heat decarbonisation projects on their own estate. So we have something called the Low Carbon Skills Fund, again an annual grant round run for us by Salix Finance, issuing smaller grants to help build heat decarbonisation plans, and that's allocated out something like £78 million over the last 4 allocation rounds, and we're currently sort of planning the next one for 2024. And complementing that is some public sector guidance which has been pulled together for us by the Energy Systems Catapult and is on their website. I failed to put the link in the slide, but I can add it before it goes onto the website. Really commend that. I think ESC have done a fantastic job, and that suite of public sector guidance on their website is really useful, and actually useful beyond just the public sector into the broader non-domestic building sector. So that's access to finance, supporting capacity and capability, and finally supplying some information and incentives. For central government, covering around 200 organisations, we have something called the Greening Government Commitments. That's a series of 5-year cycles of targets, and this is much broader than climate change. They cover waste, water, biodiversity targets and so on, led by DEFRA overall, but we lead the climate emissions one. So we're about halfway through the current 5-year phase and already thinking ahead to the next one, going out towards 2030. And it's been a very interesting time to be doing this because we've seen big changes in the usage patterns across the public estate with the pandemic and the move to home working and so on. So big changes to our energy use. But that only applies, the GGCs only apply to central government and arm's length bodies. So we're also looking at how we can improve kind of incentives and guidance for the wider public sector. And we've got a timeline to do that. We're going to publish some research in the coming months, and you can see some of that on our website. So that's the sort of 3 planks of our programme: access to finance, capacity and capability, and information and incentives. So a little bit more about the PSDS. So the PSDS has funded almost 1,000 projects to date. So you can see a typical one. The average is just a little bit over £2 million. That's projected to save 2.3 million tonnes of carbon by carbon budgets 5 and 6. And again, with my imaginary pointer, I can point you to the bar chart on the right. You can see the distribution of that. So local authorities, I don't know why it's in dollars. Maybe that's a Microsoft. It's not, it's pounds. The local authorities have had the biggest share of that, just over 700 million, and that does include maintained schools. So schools are both covered in local authorities and in their own segment further on. Second largest is the health service, and we've seen a lot of grants going to health trusts all over the country, further and higher education schools, and you can see the list on towards emergency services at the end. And as I mentioned before, the focus of our programme is on direct emissions. So at the heart of every PSDS project is a heat decarbonisation technology, principally heat pumps, but also a significant number have connected to heat networks with PSDS funding. By far the commonest is air source heat pumps, as you can see here. So this is the cohort for phase 3B projects, the ones we funded a year ago, where an air source heat pump is the single biggest measure. But we do want to see sort of rounded projects that fit with the retrofit plans for a building. So you've got things like fabric insulation, energy management, and draft proofing and so on. We can cover both the heat related elements of the fabric, but also some electricity related measures. So you'll see things like LED lighting and solar PV in there. And those are really important for balancing the bills afterwards and making sure that these retrofits produce a kind of an affordable heating system, recognizing that most people, particularly if you switch from gas to a heat pump, you don't find big bill savings from that. So adding in PV and lighting upgrades is really important. Can I get that to go to the next one? Oh, no. Looking ahead and some of the kind of challenges that we face. I mean, it's obvious that the budget is a really limiting thing. As I said, most of the public sector bodies we work with can't invest in their decarbonisation projects without support in the form of capital funding. Our current allocation is about £475 million a year, but the scheme is heavily oversubscribed. We could spend that several times over. And in fact, if we want to be on our trajectory towards those carbon budget targets and to net zero, we do need to be spending more. But I need to say this, that's a decision for Treasury, for the Chancellor, and not for me. I just try and make the case for it as best I can. But within the projects that we've already got live, we are seeing a real challenge from rising costs. And I think the construction sector has had even higher inflation and higher cost rises than the prevailing high rate of inflation that we've seen economy-wide. And that's been a real headwind for the current crop of PSDS projects. And also in there, just a little mention of the DNOs. I mean, many of these projects with heat pumps, you need an upgrade to your electricity infrastructure or to a substation. And that, again, has proven to be quite a difficult step that often trips our projects up, and we see delays from that. I would love to see more scope to bring in private investment. Many of these measures do have paybacks, particularly PV and lighting. And in a kind of capital-constrained world, I think I'm looking for creative ways to bring private investment into the public sector, but obviously subject to all those slightly tricky rules around the Treasury spending ring fence. And I think it's important to recognise that although I think the PSDS has been a really successful scheme, it's been popular, heavily oversubscribed, the projects are doing well, we are actually really only tackling the easy wins out of our building stock. And I've got a couple of what I think are two quite interesting slides here. This is the first one using just the publicly available display energy certificate data. And you can see a very typical bell curve of performance there. And there's not a hard and fast link between the rating and PSDS eligibility, but we do have something called the carbon cost threshold, and that ensures that we deliver kind of good value carbon. But that does mean that you probably can't get the most expensive, most complex retrofit projects across the line and eligible for the PSDS. So we're probably doing ones in the left-hand side of that chart. And the next slide is a really great data set from Hampshire County Council, and Colin Jackson is here today, and they've done a really detailed sort of ranking of all of their properties by thermal load in kilowatts per square metre. And this is metered data, so this isn't modelled, this is the actual heat use across their estate. Really, really fascinating. And I think it's fair to say that certainly within the constraints of the PSDS CCT, it's only those buildings at the left-hand end in the sort of green, yellow, pale browns that you can get into the PSDS successfully. You can certainly fit heat pumps into a slightly broader category, but as you go further into the red, the degree of retrofit becomes more expensive and more complex. And if we're going to get to net zero, we need to find ways to do those sort of the complex end. There must be a Heineken analogy trying to get out somewhere, but I haven't quite got to it. The bits that other programmes hadn't quite reached. But no, really grateful to Hampshire for sharing this really, really useful data set with us. So coming back to my list, just to close out. So I think that we recognise that kind of skills and capability, again, is a really significant gap. And this doesn't just apply to the public sector. I think we've got really ambitious agenda across the buildings estate. I sit in a group in the department that covers the whole of the building sector, social housing, private housing and so on. And skills and the capability gap are pretty pervasive. So we need to be investing in human skills and in the wider supply chain to meet the demands of this ambitious agenda. And then just a final point, always trying to find that sweet spot where we're decarbonising, but also generating projects that are compelling because they show energy demand reduction and bill savings. I mean, I haven't got time today, but there's an important link with the energy distribution network and demand side response as well. So we need to make sure that by electrifying heat, we don't put undue demand on local electricity networks. So that kind of brings my story to an end. I think I would characterise it by saying we have built a really successful portfolio of projects, but I'm painfully aware that there is tons more to do over the coming years, over the coming decades, and would love to sort of be in partnership with you and many others outside this room as we do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.